So it's been a minute since I did a build, so I thought I'd do a budget one. I'm gonna use mostly new parts here, and I'll have some alternatives as far as different parts that you could potentially use. I'm not gonna have an alternative for the case. This is the Okino Cypress 3 that Okino sent me to review. If you haven't checked out that video yet, please do so if you'd like. But I'm going to primarily use this case because it's a pretty good price for what it offers. I said mostly new parts, so the main part that I'm not going to get brand new is the GPU. And that's because I want to stick to about a $650 budget to show that you can use mostly new parts and stay within a pretty decent budget and still get a decent performing PC. And so this is the Gigabyte RTX 3060 12 gig. I'm not sure which model it is, but I pulled it from a used system that I had purchased a while ago. And I think I even put up a video on that, but I haven't used it since that video. And so I decided to go ahead and use it for this particular build. All right. Then I get the Ryzen 5 5500, which obviously is an AM4 build. And I picked this CPU because it's a decent performer. 12400F can be a alternative for you from Intel. The two CPUs pretty much perform the same, and 12400F is a decent gaming CPU, even for today's standards. So you would get some bottlenecking on your higher end graphics cards, but for the most part, it's a decent performer. Sticking with the AMD stuff because I, at this point, prefer AMD. We're going to use a MSI B550M motherboard, and we'll talk about alternatives for that. We're going to use a Gigabyte 650 watt power supply. This is a non-modular power supply. We've got a couple of selections for drives. I've got the King Spec 1 terabyte drive. Now this one is 2400 megabytes a second read speed, whereas the Clev drive for about $5 more is 5000 megabytes read speed, right? Now that being said, I recently did a video on Gen 5 versus Gen 4 SSDs. There was a whole lot of difference for nearly triple the price, and so you might want to check that video out if you haven't done so already, if you'd like. But the main point is, I don't know that there's going to be a lot of difference. So we're going to go with the King Spec because it's a little cheaper. You know what? Now that I think about it, let's use the Clev drive. I'm happier with that because when the time comes for you to be able to fully utilize the speed, then the Clev drive makes more sense for only $5 more. So let's go with the Clev drive. And for the RAM, there's a few different kits that I have. I've got some SK Hynix kits at 32 gigs, 3200 megahertz at CL16. They're all 3200 megahertz CL16. Then I've got the T-Force Vulcan Z red RAMs. And then I got some gray ones. And this is a 16 gig kit, also 3200 at CL16. And then we've got the G-Skill Trident Z 3200 megahertz at CL16 as well. And these have RGB in it, right? And so if we wanted to stay at our lowest budget point, then I'd say we'd do the 16 gig kit because it's about half the price as the 32 gig kit. If we want a little bit more long-term usage without having to constantly do upgrades and things like that, then I think the 32 gig kit makes sense. And since we're going to use some Thermalright TLS12 fans in here that are RGB, then having a little more RGB on the RAM makes sense, and it's not a whole lot more than these other two kits over here. So we're going to go with the G-Skill kit, but I'll show you how you can reduce costs, and what your alternatives are on the back end. All right, so as far as the CPU cooler goes, we're going to use the stock CPU coolers, but I'll have an alternative or two on the back end for the CPU cooler as well. That's it. These are the parts that we're going to use, and I think we're going to be able to come in around 650, maybe even under. So let's get to building, and then we'll benchmark it and go over the performance, and then we'll go over some alternatives and what the total cost was and what the cost with the alternatives are. Okay. All right. I'll be right back. All right, that's the build. So let's turn it on and make sure everything's working, and then we'll run some benchmarks. This part always makes me nervous. So far, so good. All right, so looks like we're doing good. CPU temperature is a little on the hot side. It's at 37C. That goes down to 36. Let's see if it goes down to 35. 35, about 34. 34. All right, looks like we're good. So I'm gonna adjust the memory here. Oh, we're only at 16 gigs. I might need to change out that RAM. I might change out the RAM, but other than that, everything's good. So I'll go off screen and run some benchmarks and I'll be back. Okay, so how did this PC perform? So what I did was I tested 3 different games. They're all pretty demanding games and GPU intensive. So although it's not a lot of games, I think it's a fair assessment of what this PC can do. I made a couple of different runs with a couple of different settings on a couple of those games, and we'll get into that as we talk about each individual game. Also, I didn't do any 4K runs, as this particular build isn't built for 4K, and so I thought it'd be an unfair assessment to even try to use 4K numbers. First game we ran is Cyberpunk 2077 at 1440p ultra settings, and there we did 41.5 average FPS and 31.7 FPS on the 1% lows. 1080p ultra settings, we did 69.1 FPS on average and 50.7 FPS on the 1% lows. The hottest the CPU got was 70.5C. The hottest the GPU got was 71.1C. The hotspot on the GPU was 90.8C. That's a little bit on the high side. I'd like to see it closer, about like anywhere from 85 to 88, maybe 89. 90.8 is a little bit high, but this is an older GPU. I also tested this game on high settings because I wanted to be fair as to what the PC is capable of doing, and ultra settings a little bit on the unfair side, and so I wanted to make sure that we did a fair assessment of what it can do. And so for Cyberpunk 2077 at 1440p high settings, that did 50.5 average FPS and 41.4 FPS on the 1% lows. And at 1080p high settings, we did 79.8 FPS on average and 60.9 FPS on the 1% low, so pretty decent scores. The hottest the CPU got on this run was 70.4C. The hottest the GPU got was 71.2C, and the hotspot on the GPU was 91C. Then we did Black Myth Wukong, similar kind of run with very high and high settings. So at 1440p very high settings, we did 40.2 average FPS and 32.7 on the 1% lows. And at 1080p very high settings, we did 44.9 FPS on average and 36.3 on the 1% lows. The CPU got up to 76.5C on the temperatures, and the GPU got up to 68.9C with a hotspot of 88C. Then Black Myth Wukong on 1440p high settings did 75.7 FPS on average and 58.7 on the 1% lows. And at 1080p high settings, it did 85.3 FPS on average and 64.6 FPS on the 1% lows. So that might be our sweet spot right there. The CPU got up to, on that run, 65.4C. The GPU got up to 69.4C with a hotspot of 90.5C. Then the third game I tested was Dune Awakening. On this one, I did just the high settings because the ultra settings seem to bog it down too much, and doing medium settings seemed like I would be hedging my bets a little bit rather than trying to push this PC to do its best performance at its highest settings. So I just went with high settings for Dune Awakening. And so For that game at 1440p high, we did 55.3 FPS on average and 40.1 FPS on the 1% lows. At 1080p high settings, we did 73.7 FPS on average and 56.6 FPS on the 1% lows. The hottest the CPU got was 69.9 C. The hottest the GPU got was 71 C with a hotspot of 91.3 C. Right, so how did we do on our build and our cost? I think we did pretty good. So I'm going to go over the components I ended up using, and as I'm talking about those components, I'll talk about a little bit about some alternatives that you could be looking at. All right, so let's start with the CPU. The CPU I used was the AMD Ryzen 5 5500. And a good alternative would be the Intel 12400F, which is about almost exactly the same kind of performance CPU between the two. The Ryzen 5500 costs $73, and the 12400F is going for $115. As far as the GPU goes, I went with the Gigabyte Gaming OC RTX 3060 with 12 gigabytes of VRAM. I did an average cost on eBay of the latest ones sold, of the last 6 sold, and that came out to be about like $200. Although one of them was selling for about like 122, 123, something like that. An alternative for that GPU could be something like the RX 7600 XT, which has 16 gigs of RAM. The other alternative could be something that's a little bit newer, which is the Intel Battlemage B580, which has 12 gigabytes of VRAM. Those would be decent alternatives. Both of those probably cost you about like $50 to $100 more than this GPU that you can get on the used market. I think the 3060 is the better way to go. All three of them are kind of close together for performance, although the B580 probably does a lot better on some newer games. For the motherboard, I went with the MSI B550M VDH, mostly because I had that motherboard already on hand. That motherboard's going for $109 right now. I got it when I picked it up, which was a few months back. I picked it up for about 90 bucks, and it's been sitting on my shelf ever since. I was planning on doing a build sooner or later with it, and so here it is. But we're going to stick with current prices when we conclude with the total cost of this build. All right, so that's the motherboard I went with. An alternative to the motherboard I picked is the MSI B550M Pro-VC, which is going for about 100 bucks, so about 9 bucks less, maybe 10 bucks less. The Intel alternative for this motherboard would be something like the MSI Pro H610M-G. And yes, I do like MSI motherboards, so, deal with it. All right, now the unfortunate thing about that particular motherboard is it does not have a USB Type-C header, so you're gonna have to sometimes sacrifice certain things when you're doing more budget builds, and so that's one of those sacrifices. And that motherboard's going for $121, which is a decent amount more than the AM4 motherboards. The case I used was the Okinos Cypress 3 wood, which if you haven't checked that out, I did a review on this case a little while ago. Go ahead and check that out if you'd like, but it was a decent enough case that I thought I could do a build in, and as you can see, it came out pretty nice looking. So I'm pretty happy with how it turned out, and this is a $60 case, and it comes with 4 installed fans. Those fans are static fans. I believe it was 1,000 RPMs, and so that's why I swapped those fans out with these fans right here, and we'll talk a little bit more about those fans in a little bit. There's not a lot of good alternatives out there at the $60 range, but there are some a little bit larger, some a little bit smaller. Most of them are going to be a little bit larger than this one, and most of them are probably not going to come with fans. Some will, but you're probably looking closer at about like $70, $75 is the range you'd be looking at really with the ones that come with fans, especially RGB fans. The power supply I used was the Gigabyte 650 watt non-modular 80 plus gold power supply, and that goes for $60. There's some alternative power supplies. Some are modular, some are semi-modular, some are non-modular, and most of those power supplies are not going to be 80 plus gold at the $60 range. The Gigabyte I felt was the best choice for this particular build. SSD, the NVMe M.2 SSD that I used was the Clevcraft C910, which I've used in other builds in the past. And again, I did a video a little while ago testing Gen 5 versus Gen 4 SSD, which this Clev drive is. It's a Gen 4 drive. I took a look at the difference in performance for practical everyday use, such as gaming and doing other productivity stuff. And so I took it through the paces to see how much of a difference there was. You might want to check that video out if you haven't. Anyways, so that's the drive I went with. And the Clev drive is going for $60 right now. And I picked it up actually for about like $51 when I bought it. Which again was a few months ago. But right now it's going for $60. And an alternative could be something like a King Spec 1 terabyte NVMe that's going for like $53, I think it was. But you're talking about like less than half the read speed as far as what it's capable of doing. I don't think you're going to see a whole lot of difference between the two drives for the most part, but you will notice it here and there, especially if you're moving files around. And so the Clev drive is 5,000 megabytes a second read speed, whereas the King Spec drive is 2,400 megabytes a second read speed. All right, going back to the fans that I was talking about earlier when I was talking about the case, what I went with was 2 packs of 3 of the Thermalright TL-S12 ARGB PWM fans. And so you can control the fan speeds, you can control the LEDs, and it's by Thermalright, who historically has made pretty decent fans and cooling systems. Believe it or not, each 3-pack costs about $14. Pretty good price. So the 2 3-packs that I got comes out to be $28. Not a lot of alternatives out there compared to these fans and what the price points are versus what they can do. So if you're in the market for some PWM ARGB fans that are decent performers, I think these are 1500 RPM fans. Can't really go wrong with Thermalright. For the RAM kit, there were several options that I could have gone with. I originally put in the G-Scale Trident Z RGB sticks that I had on hand, but I forgot that that's a kit of 16 gigs, and I wanted to build a PC with 32 gigs of RAM, not 16 gigs. And so I also had a red set of the T-Force Vulcan Z, same speed, 3200 megahertz, same cast latency of 16, so no difference there, but this kit was 32 gigs. There's also, you know, a gray version, kind of like a gunmetal kind of color that you could get to match the black interior if you wanted. I think those are going for like about $73 for the kit. Now you could have also gotten the T-Force Vulcan Z 16 gig kit, 3200 megahertz at CL16, and that runs about like $41, right? And so you could save some money there. Personally, I think 32 gigs is the sweet spot. Right, so for the cost of this PC for the components I picked, that came out to be $663. So came pretty close to that $650 mark. I actually hit that $650 mark if we take into account the $90 I spent on the motherboard rather than the $109 that it's going for right now. But, you know, I got to be fair and use current pricing, right? If I was going to get technical about it, I Okino sent me this case to review at no charge, and so that's another $60. So technically I could take $70 off the top and be under $600 with this PC. But again, with current prices, with the current components that I picked, if you were to buy these components, it would come out to be about $663. Now, if you picked the least costing components to get as far down as you could with the cost, then that could run you as low as $538. And that's based off of if you could find that 3060 card at like 122, 123, I think it was. If you find a 3060 at that low of cost point, I used $200 because that was the average that I found. Even at 663, this is a pretty good price for this build for its performance. And this could last you for years. So yeah, I'm pretty happy with this build, and I think it came out pretty good. Let me know down in the comments what you guys think, and let me know if you've got other components that you think could have been better or might have been better or has better price point. Let me know about that. And if you got any questions, feel free to write them down in the comments. If you've got anything to say, write them down in the comments as well. I'm more than happy to get back to you guys. And if you like this video and found the information helpful or at least entertaining, then please hit that like and subscribe down below. It does help out the channel a ton. In the meantime, thanks for joining me, and I'll see you in the next one.